This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. I'm Herman K. Trabich. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast, my guest is Johannes Pfeifenberger, principal with U.S. business consultant, the Brattle Group. Johannes is going to describe the macrogrid initiative, calling for widely interconnecting the U.S. electric network to make electricity delivery more reliable and affordable. And he's going to describe how closing gaps in current work on transmission planning by federal regulators could be a key first step to that objective. Johannes has spent 35 years with the Brattle Group, and much of his research has guided state and federal regulators on how to modernize and expand the U.S. transmission system. He's currently also a visiting scholar with MIT's Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research and a senior member of the prestigious IEEE Power and Energy Society. So, Johannes, let's start with this. What is the concept of a macrogrid? What were its earlier iterations? And what is it designed to actually address?
Very good question. First, thank you for the kind introduction and having me here. Very much appreciate this opportunity. Macrogrid, when it comes to the transmission wires that we all use on a daily basis, really refers to the equivalent of the interstate highway system in a grid that's otherwise mostly state highways and local roads with some links, within each region. The reality is the U.S. is not an integrated grid. The U.S. is connected, but it's mostly planned on a multi-state regional basis. We have these regional grid operators that plan transmission within their region. They're connected with each other, but there's no real planning of the high voltage transmission grid that can ship power across the United States the way an interstate highway system would allow us to travel across the states. And as our load is growing and as weather systems are impacting different regions, it's become quite clear that there's a big benefit from interconnecting regions more strongly. And probably about 20 years ago, the ideas first emerged of creating sort of a superhighway for the transmission system that would take the existing sort of regional state grids into a more national level. And, I think Dale Osborne at MISO, the mid-continent system operator, might have first created the term macrogrid. But we have quite a few initiatives that are also macrogrid initiatives that are trying to find ways to build a highway system for electricity, an interstate highway system for transmission. We have many studies done by the national labs, done by the universities, showing that we could save more money than this grid would cost. So it would help reduce electricity rates if we had a more interconnected grid. But to be honest, these concepts haven't really gotten beyond the concept stage. So
Okay.
the macrogrid initiative is an initiative that lays out a concept, but we haven't really gotten much further than that.
Okay. Yeah, I love your analogy because imagine that if a company was a trucking company, and they started out in Pennsylvania, and they wanted to get something to California, but they couldn't get any farther on the highway system than Chicago or Western Illinois. I mean, that's what we have in the grid, right? And that's PJM, for instance.
Right. And what we've also seen, even in the last 5 years or so, we had some polar vortexes and some heat waves that affected, say, the Midwest, where, the East Coast shipped thousands of megawatts of power to the Midwest to help them deal with, the cold snaps or the heat waves. And we couldn't ship as much as we had because the transmission grid is just not strong enough for these big transactions.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the you've done a lot of research, the potential costs and benefits of a macro grid. First of all, um, it would cost money to build these very high capacity 765 kilovolt lines. Then you could they would be there for what, 30, 40, 50 years or more, and you'd be shipping electricity. You could find the cheapest electricity. Do you have any numbers, or can you talk a little bit more about how that would work?
Yeah, I mean, we are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars for a grid like that. There are two technologies that are being discussed for that. One is, as you said, the 765 kV alternating current transmission lines. So those are the typical transmission lines. We have a number of 765 kV lines in the country already, but those are the highest capacity alternating current transmission lines, and expanding them. The Midwest is already planning to build a bunch of them, but there's no sort of national plan. I think American Electric Power had proposed a national plan for 765 kV network that looks a lot like the interstate highway system. That I think that was back in 2006 or something like that. But since then, most of the macrogrid ideas have centered on what's called high voltage direct current lines. Those are lines that can ship power over longer distances than even the 765 kV AC lines. So a lot of the macrogrid designs that you see, I would say two-thirds of them are focused on these AC or DC transmission lines. And
Hmm.
I think I might have missed part of your question. So whatever I
Well,
didn't answer.
what about the benefits? You just talked about the cost, hundreds of millions of dollars, but the benefits, I think your research has shown, and there have been examples of benefits just from segments of where electricity is transferred across regions.
Yeah.
Um, can you tell us a little bit about the benefits?
Yeah, of course. Um, the benefits of building transmission are really saving um, other costs related to the electricity grid. Those are mostly costs related to power generation or fuel costs of running one higher cost power plant instead of a lower cost power plant that couldn't run because there's not enough transmission to ship the lower cost power to where it's needed. It's also, the grid is not just um, designed to produce the electricity we uh, need on average for the year. The grid needs to be designed to supply the maximum, the peak load that might occur only once in 10 years, because we don't want to have blackouts more than once in 10 years or so. That is sort of the reliability standard. So these peak loads are often driven by weather, um, and the weather doesn't hit the entire country at the same time. So part of the transmission grid's benefits are if you diversify across a larger geographic footprint, if your grid is bigger than the weather, you don't need to install as much generation to meet those peaks because you can ship power from another part of the country that doesn't have that weather at this point in time. Sometimes there might only be a day difference between when Chicago has the bad weather and when New York has the bad weather, but that day allows us to ship power back and forth. And so the savings really come from being able to use the lowest cost generation that's available at any point in time and not having to build as much generation because you can basically backstop each other. And when you do these calculations, there are many studies by universities and the national labs under the Department of Energy some of our own work. And if you look at some of what the regional planners have been doing on benefit cost analysis for transmission, you can generally save about $2 to $3 for every dollar you spend on transmission. So the
Wow.
transmission grid is one of these things where you have to spend money to save money. But if you do it right and you build the right type of transmission, you can basically get $2 or $3 worth of savings out of every dollar you spend on transmission. So if we spend $500 billion on a transmission grid overlay, we would expect to save 100 or a
$1.5
trillion
trillion.
dollars or $1.5 trillion dollars
Mm.
over time. And as you said earlier, these transmission lines, they have a very long life. I mean, we still use transmission lines that were built 100 years ago. Not very often, but generally 50, 60, 70, 80 years is what the typical life of these lines is. So just like the highway system, it is an investment in the future. It needs to be pay off. It has to be paying off now because you don't want to build all that infrastructure before you need it. But we have the studies that tell us that even now we would already benefit from um, being able to use that transmission if we had it.
The reason that we haven't done this sort of self-evident improvement of our electric system is kind of interesting and complicated. There are a lot of challenges. There are a lot of things that regulators have to work out. But over the years, I've noticed that you always come back to the opposition to building these lines comes from people that have financial self-interest in not being able to deliver generation from outside when it's needed. And they have created a situation where they have something called a right of first refusal. These are people who have built smaller transmission systems, I think, and they sort of oppose at every turn of the regulatory process building this macro grid. So, can you tell us a little bit more? Break down a little bit what I've been trying to get at here.
Yeah, no, transmission is difficult to build for a number of reasons. It's not just self-interested parties who would financially gain or not. Landowners don't want to look at transmission lines. Um, the challenge is also that we have, you know, retail electricity rates are state regulated. Transmission is federally regulated, but it's
Mm.
planned on a regional basis. So you have regional planners that need to accommodate multiple states. The states have different interests. One state doesn't want to pay for transmission that benefits another state. So it's very hard to figure out this thing called cost allocation, who should pay for what. Some states feel like they wouldn't get the benefits, so why should they be paying for it? And it's sometimes hard to figure out exactly who benefits and who benefits when. Um, the permitting of new transmission line is at the state level. Sometimes states will not permit a transmission unless they have a benefit from doing so. So there's just many different hurdles. And it also means there's no silver bullet to make this go. We're not living in a vampire movie where silver bullet is all it takes because you know um, there's no one solution. There are many different challenges that all need to be addressed. It often starts with just understanding the value that a well-planned transmission grid can provide to the states and to its customers. It's not well understood. In the last 10 years, I think the level of understanding has increased tremendously. So we now see states getting together, like all the Midwestern states are really organizing, and that's why some of the grid operators in the Midwest are able to build larger multi-state transmission lines than in some other regions. We have states in the Northeast get together into a collaborative to think about the grid more holistically. So it is happening that some of these barriers are slowly being worked on and addressed, but it's easier within the region because we have regional planners. It's very hard to do any of this across the regions because we don't have any planning processes that are effective for planning across the regions or across the country. We can do a study, but these are mostly academic studies that said, wouldn't it be nice? Here would be the benefits, but then we don't have the institutions and the planning processes that can actually design a transmission line and get it approved.
Mm. Okay, well, that brings us to the next question because the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has, during the Biden administration, and then recently, even more recently in this administration, has been working on Order 1920. It was a big effort to advance the transmission planning process. And it could be, I think a lot of people believe, a significant advance. But I think you have some questions about that. Will 1920 or other recent FERC actions be steps toward a macrogrid? Could it lay the groundwork for an expanded and modernized transmission system? What could it do to do that? And is it going to do that, I guess?
Yeah, I think Order 1920 has a chance of nudging us a bit in the right directions. Order 1920 is somewhat limited. It's focused on regional planning uh, with a long-term, like 20-year perspective. It includes some additional requirements for better coordination between the regions, and it creates avenues for states to come in and say, we want the regional planners to build certain transmission lines. So that will all be very helpful because we do see the states coordinating more on these things. And Order 1920 will be helpful in creating a planning framework that is more systematic in how these cost savings can be estimated and calculated. But I think it's only going to be a nudge. The regional planners will probably tell us that they're already doing most of this, and in many cases, we'll just see some, improvements on the margin. But I'm hopeful that the ability for states to propose regional and interregional projects to the grid operator, that might be a new mechanism to facilitate some of that. Unfortunately, I don't see that we can get to a macro grid on a state-by-state basis, just like we couldn't get the interstate highway system built if we left it to the states, right? So there would need to be some leadership at the national level to make this work. The one way where we could get to something that looks more like a macro grid is by connecting in the future the regional grids that are being built by the regional grid operators. Like you mentioned, 765 kV transmission line. Those are the highest voltage, highest capacity transmission line we have ever built in this country. And the system operators in the Midwest, MISO and SVP specifically, they are planning to add a macro grid within their region that consists of a number of these 765 kV projects. And if you put these regional plans next to each other, you see that they're not far from each other. So once we have those regional 765 kV lines that are really creating transfer capability within the regions, we could actually connect them with additional 765 kV line. And by the time we're done, maybe 30 years from now, we'll have something that looks like a macro grid.
Did you say 3 or 30 years from now?
30 years.
Uh,
Even 1920, the compliance filings would come in this year or next year. then the ISO would do a study process. The study process might take anywhere between 3 and 5 years. So maybe by the early 2030s, we would have a new plan coming out of or the 1920s. Then it would take 5 to 10 years to build those lines. So now we're in the late 30s, early 40s. And then we only have the first tranche of these regional plans. And then maybe sometime in the 2030s, people realize, hey, we can connect them and create more of a national grid. And then that same process happens again. So, by the time we actually get to a national grid this way, would probably be 2050, unless there's a federal initiative that says, we as a country need this, we want to make this work. And you would almost have to create a planning authority who can implement that.
Yeah. Okay.
But
Okay. So if you get there by 2050, then it's not 30 years, Hannes. It's only 25.
oh yes, that's true. That's true.
If you want to hear the big last exchange of this terrific conversation, support the podcast by subscribing at just $2.99 per month to the Power Sector Podcasts Power More. With your subscription, you'll get both parts of the content delivered directly to you the second they drop.